So today we're going to wrap up with chapter 25. We're going to look at a few more examples of revolution, and we're going to talk about the political ideologies that were behind these revolutions. So where we left off last class, we had just finished up the entire French Revolution in about 5 minutes, which is a fairly impressive accomplishment, and we didn't nearly do it justice. And sometime during Flex, we'll give you the story of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna and all that, because there's some funny stuff that happens. But today we're going to move on to Haiti. Now, the reading quiz that you just took gave you some insight into this Haitian Revolution. But basically what happens is Haiti, small island in the Caribbean, was kind of jointly owned by Spain and France. There were about 500,000 imported African slaves on the island of Haiti. 500,000. And there was probably somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 French and Spanish plantation owners. So the odds are not in your favor if you're European. But you have guns. But even if it's 4,000 against 500,000, those are not good odds. And so what we find is that the slaves are able to successfully revolt against the Europeans. They're led by this man on a horse. He's oftentimes nicknamed as the Black George Washington. He wore the same fashions at the time as George Washington. And his name was Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture. And Louverture was not actually his birth name. It wasn't his given name. It was actually a nickname awarded to him out of respect by the French. Louverture actually means the opening. And Toussaint had this apparently innate ability to find the weaknesses in the French forces that he was fighting, and time after time defeat them, despite the fact that they were better trained and better equipped. And so the French began calling him Louverture, the opening. Louverture also has the distinction of being the guy that wrecks Napoleon's plans of world domination. Because when the slaves rebel, Napoleon sends French soldiers across the Atlantic to Haiti, and they lose. And at this point, Napoleon is forced to reevaluate his plans, and he figures, well, if I can't even hang on to this little tiny island of Haiti, what are the chances I have of ruling the whole planet? None. The other reason why it's scary, like your reading quiz talked about, is that this was a slave rebellion. This was not like the American or the French Revolution, where these were enlightened, educated, middle-class people rebelling against an oppressive government. These were the absolute bottom of society, slaves rebelling over everybody else, middle class, upper class, whatever. That terrifies the rest of Latin America. So, on the one hand, it does provide yet another example that colonial powers could be defeated. But at the same time, it comes as a giant warning message. Be thinking about how you treat the people at the bottom of your society. James? Right, or don't have that many slaves. Right. Right, but then production goes down. So I guess it's, which way do you want to die? Starvation or revolution? Right. Okay, political ideologies that you need to be aware of. Some of these terms are unique to this period in history. Some of them are good throughout all time. Caudillos are unique to this period. Caudillos were strong Latin American military leaders, generals, typically. You guys have heard of Santa Anna in Mexico? You learned about him in middle school, I'm assuming? Mexican-American War, Santa Anna, Alamo. Ring any bells? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, in Texas. Santa Anna would be an example of a caudillo, strong military leader. When I think of caudillos, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I get this image in my head of cowboy. Maybe it's because I think cowboy and caudillo sound similar. But it's that same sort of mentality. It's that cowboy mentality of shoot 'em up, guns blazing, take power by force and danger and things like that. And that's typically how the caudillos take power in Latin America. Right, it's a military dictator, a military warlord. Now, sometimes they're nice. Sometimes they're very charismatic, they're very personable. Santa Anna was very personable. He wasn't necessarily nice, but he had charisma. And so you should not think of these caudillos as these evil tyrants. Oftentimes they did have the best interest of some of their people at heart. Sometimes they were power hungry, but that happens. Now, the next four are interchangeable throughout history. And we've broken them up into their opposite pairings. So centralists and federalists are opposites of each other. Liberals and conservatives, opposites of each other. So centralists typically support a strong, centralized national government. So centralists, central government. Federalists want strong regional or state governments. So centralists, central government; federalists, local governments. It's just preference in terms of how you think people's needs are best met. The argument against central government is always, if we take the United States, does Texas have different issues than Alaska? Yeah. So on some level, shouldn't Texas and Alaska be able to run things differently? Do 9th graders and 12th graders have different needs? Yeah. So on some level, shouldn't they be treated differently? Yeah. That's always going to be the federalist argument, the argument for local government. You can't treat everybody the same. The argument for the centralists, though, is, yeah, but if you start making the rules too different, there's corruption, there's inequity, there is unfairness. If we let the seniors go out for lunch any place they want, Chipotle, Chick-fil-A, whatever, and everybody else has to eat cafeteria food, does that seem fair?
Yes.
Yeah, but what if we don't keep it around when you are? Right, then you'd rebel. And so this is where the centralist argument gains some traction, is at some point people want to be treated the same. On some level, people want to know that the rules they have to live by are the same rules that other people have to live by. The taxes you pay are the same taxes other people pay. A central government can do that. Federalist governments would not be able to ensure that everybody was treated the same way. The reason we bring this up is because in Latin America, as they're forming their new governments, this is what they have to figure out. All right, great, we fought the battle, we kicked out Spain. Yay, parade, go to bed. Next day, what do we do? What kind of government do we get? Central one? Or do we break up our country into states and let the states govern themselves? It's hard to decide. Well, and you can have both, but then you're going to have tension, and you see that here. We have a central government, we have a president, we have a Congress, we have a Supreme Court that oversee the entire nation. And each state also has a government and a Supreme Court and an executive leader. But then we also have conflict between the two, where sometimes the states say, but I want to do this, and the federal government says, no, you can't. How do you resolve that? It's tricky. All right, so the other two political ideologies, liberals and conservatives. And many of you guys have asked me about that, and I've tried to give you the condensed version. And the condensed version is typically that liberals want change, and liberals are typically supportive of individual rights. Liberals want change, and liberals are typically supportive of individual rights. Conservatives go the other way. Conservatives want to maintain tradition. They want to maintain society as it is. And they are typically more concerned about the government as a whole, the nation as a whole, instead of individual rights. And again, these are all ideologies that these new Latin American nations, once they gain their independence, have to resolve. How much freedom do we give to the people? And how much, especially since so many of these Latin American countries are based on slave labor, how much do we not give rights to the people and just maintain the current system? We just kick out the Spanish and now the Creoles take power. and we keep everything else the same. That would be the conservative plan. The liberals would be talking about, man, we got to get rid of slavery. We got to give equal rights to the African slaves, to the American Indians, to everybody. Everybody should be treated the same. The conservatives are going, what are you talking about? That's going to totally change society. The liberals are like, yeah, I know. What do you do? Which way do you go? All right, questions about any of this? Emily.
Were there like varying degrees of this in the different thought traditions?
Yes. Yes, there are always varying degrees, especially of these four. I mean, you can have people that are somewhat centralist or somewhat federalist. You can have people that are passionately liberal and staunchly conservative. So we usually talk about people being on the left or the right, or being in the middle, moderates. You can be a radical liberal and want the same for everybody all the time. You can be a radical conservative and not care at all about individual rights. You can move slowly towards the middle and modify that position and see more and more of the other person's side. So there are degrees for both of these groups. Nick? Okay, let me know if it comes back to you. All right. Other things to think about. Nick?
Where does the term being on the left and being on the right come from?
Being on the left and being on the right has to do with the way that people are seated in representative governments. So in Parliament, if you are seated on the left side, depending on your perspective, you are in the House of Commons. If you are seated on the right, you are seated in the House of Lords, which is typically more conservative. If you are sitting in the United States Congress, if you are seated on the left side, that's where the Democrats sit. If you are seated on the right side, that's where the Republicans sit. Republicans are typically conservative, Democrats are typically liberal. So that's where you get the term being on the left, is that you are physically seated on the left side of the house of your government. Make sense? Okay, other things that come up during this time, and I apologize, but I'm going to race through this quick because I want to get to Mexico and Brazil. Some of the people on the far, far left, liberals, that want rights for everybody, are going to go to Marxism and socialism, where you take society's resources and distribute them evenly across all social classes in an attempt to ultimately get rid of social class. That's Marxism. Socialism is just where you take some of society's resources and distribute them to take care of some of everyone's basic needs. But you still allow for some differentiation in terms of wealth and possessions. David?
So could like the United States tax system be considered like a small portion of that?
There are some people that want to call the United States tax system a little bit socialist. Socialism typically has more to do with how the money is spent rather than how much money is taken. But the president's health care plan, some people want to target that as socialist because it's trying to take care of everybody. Some people look at welfare as a socialist program because you're taking money away from the people that have it to give it to the people that don't. All right, other things that are happening in Latin America. Once you kick out the Spanish, what are you constantly dreaming about at night, terrified that it's going to happen? The Europeans are going to come back. Fears of recolonization. Now, it's kind of funny, but the United States actually issues, and I have a video of this on our Vision page, the United States actually issues something called the Monroe Doctrine, in which the United States steps up on a box, metaphorically speaking, and says, I forbid any European country from coming into Latin America and interfering. We're like 30 years removed from signing the Constitution. Like, we have just started as a new country. And here we are threatening all of Europe, don't you dare come back here or I'll whoop up on you. I have to imagine they were sitting on the other side of the ocean going, seriously? Like, I'm half tempted to come over there just to see what you'll do. Yeah, remember, we beat the JV team.
Yeah, and then what about 1812?
Well, remember, the British are still distracted by their colonial possessions, so we never got the full might of the British military.
Actually, I read somewhere that is in a book about the War of 1812 that the troops who attacked and burned Washington were actually veterans of the campaign against Napoleon.
Not that we didn't get some. I'm just saying we never got the full might of the British Empire because they were too spread out. They wouldn't have been able to send everything at us because it would have left so many of their other holdings unprotected. All right. We talked about this in the reading quiz. Other things that happened during these independence movements, we don't see any change in women's status in Latin America. So even though they helped fight in the revolutions in Mexico and in Venezuela and in Argentina and Chile and Brazil, nobody stops and says, wow, you guys, well, you ladies, were so awesome, we should give you the right to vote. We should give you more opportunities in the economy. They're like, hey, good job, back home. Appreciate the help. We probably could have done it without you, but, thanks for chipping in. Interestingly enough, one of the minor additions they give to women is they allow more teaching positions to be filled by women because they look at teaching professions as inherently feminine. You're nurturing children. You're taking care of them. You're basically already doing what you do in the home. Women can go do that. That's women's work. Interestingly enough, this allows for a very, very subversive long-term plan to get set in motion because if generations of students are being taught by women, how are their views of women going to slowly change? Right, they're slowly going to improve their own view of women because they're now going to be looking at women as leaders, as role models, as mentors, as intelligent. It's going to be very, very hard to shove them back in that same box once you've been forced to look at them as a respectful authority figure growing up. We're also going to see an end to most of the caste systems throughout Latin America, but just because you end political policy, guess what you don't necessarily change? Attitudes in people's minds. You can outlaw slavery, but you can't convince somebody who is racist that all people are equal. It takes a lot longer to change people's minds than it does laws. Laws can be changed overnight. Changing society's mentality takes generations. Last thing we see is that many nations in Latin America realize that they cannot industrialize and compete with Europe. Instead, they are going to really have to keep doing the same thing they've been doing, export raw materials to Western nations. Now they just get to do it on their own terms. So again, it's not often we get to talk about it, but this is where poop comes into play. Bat guano and bird guano become highly lucrative export commodities, especially from Peru. You never thought there'd be much money in poop. Yeah, fertilizer. But this is also going to encourage the West to want to continue to involve themselves in Latin America, which is one of the reasons why the Panama Canal gets built. Western intervention in Latin America. And there's a video about that on the Vision page too. Yes?
One of the two asterisks.
Those are the movie links to remind me to tell you that there are movies on Vision. Because, I'm getting old and my memory starts to go. All right, very quickly. Let's talk about Mexico. Mexico, on the eve of revolution, has all kinds of problems. It's not terribly wealthy. None of the Latin American nations are, because the Spaniards have typically been stripping these lands of their wealth. There's huge social class divisions because you've had a very, very small elite class, lording it over all of these slaves and natives and things like that. And you have lots of foreign interest in Mexico, whether it's the Spanish or the British or the United States. And so what we see is a wide variety of attempts at independence. Your book talks about, even before we get to Santa Anna, a former priest whose last name is Hidalgo actually leads a revolution with the locals, the American Indians, and almost successfully kicks out the Spanish. Now, again, that scares the crap out of the Creole class. But they eventually realize that they need to unite with the natives in order to kick out the Europeans. And so they do. But when they unite, and when they successfully kick out the Spanish, and when they successfully form a new government, guess what kind of government they create? A monarchy. Because that's what they know. Guess what the United States almost did after they kicked out the British? They almost made George Washington a king. Right. When the French rebelled, they got rid of Louis XVI. They lived through the Reign of Terror. And then they got Napoleon, and guess what Napoleon does? Makes himself emperor. And then when they got rid of Napoleon, they bring back another king. Most often in these revolutions, it was common to replace one monarchy with another. Right. Because that's the system you know. That's the system you trust. You don't know any other way to do it. And so typically the implementation of democracy takes a while. And then you're going to have some of these caudillos like Santa Anna. They want power for themselves too. Now you will eventually see a representative government take place in Mexico. And it's under the leadership of Benito Juarez. And Benito Juarez is a liberal. And as a liberal, that means he's interested in individual rights and freedoms. And so Benito Juarez implements this series of policies in an attempt to give land and property to the lower class so they can start to pick themselves up and not be so poor. But in giving land to the lower class, really all he did was open the door for wealthy investors to buy up all that land and force all the peasants to work for him. And so in the meantime, as Juarez is trying to make all of these people's lives better, what ends up happening is his programs get twisted and corrupted. And before you know it, all the people he was trying to help were worse off than they were before. Plus, in the meantime, Mexico fought a very unsuccessful war with the United States over Texas, the Mexican-American War, and they lost Texas, which meant they lost half of their territory, but only 5% of their population. So now the remaining 95% of their population has to live in half the territory they had before and subsist on half the resources they had before, knowing that there is now this tension with the United States going forward. And so here again you see this transition. Juarez gets fed up, he gets kicked out of power, they actually put in a monarch, a European monarch. The French come in and help the people overthrow Juarez. Yeah, Maximilian von Habsburg. Comes in and rules Mexico, and then Juarez kicks him out and comes back and takes total power. So this liberal reformer that got kicked out because his liberal policies didn't work eventually comes back and returns as a dictator. It's all messed up. Not that you have to know every step of that, but it's more you need to see the chaos of those transitions. Now, one other quick thing about Brazil. So we're going to jump down to Napoleon on his motorcycle, just because it's a funny picture. Napoleon invades Spain and Portugal. Napoleon conquers Spain and puts his brother in charge. Napoleon conquers Portugal, but the Portuguese royal family escapes. Now, if you are the Portuguese royal family, where are you going to go to be safe? Your biggest colony and your closest colony, Brazil. So the royal family of Portugal goes to Brazil and essentially sets up shop in Brazil and makes Brazil the new capital of their empire. which means Brazil gets a very different colonial experience. It's not like King George ever came and lived in Massachusetts.
Oh, cool.
It would have been cool. Now, what this means is that when Brazil starts to get all feisty and want to think about independence, perhaps one of the greatest strategies I've ever heard of was put into place. The King of Portugal recognizes Portugal is going to demand... to be continued.